In NBA history, there have only been 3 players to play for one single team for over 20 years. Only been 8 players to play for 15 plus years on a single team. Needless to say, it's almost inevitable for the majority of NBA players to play for more than one team in their career. When it comes to players on teams you may have forgotten about, there are some pretty obvious ones. For example, did you remember Shaq in his time on the Celtics? How about Dwayne Wade when he signed with the Bulls and later the Cavs? Karl Malone and Gary Payton tried to team up with the Lakers and win a ring toward the end of their career. But what about Scottie Pippen, who was traded to the Rockets from the Bulls and only played 50 games for Houston? Do you know any of these? This list is in no type of numerical order. However, we are going to put these players into 3 categories. The first category is for players who started their career on a team you might have forgotten about. The second category is for players that played on a forgotten team in the middle of their career. And the last category is for players on forgotten teams they ended their career with. So, without further ado, let's take a deeper look at 50 NBA players on teams you may have forgotten about. Known for his 9 seasons and bringing a championship to the city of Toronto, Kyle Lowry was actually drafted by the Memphis Grizzlies. Even after that, and still before his time in Toronto, Lowry was also on the Rockets. Dude was running the pick and roll with Yao Ming and Dikembe Mutombo. I 100% did not realize that Nikola Vucevic was drafted by the 76ers in 2011. He was actually involved in the Dwight Howard to LA trade, which is how he ended up in Orlando after just 1 season in Philly. Before stealing millions of dollars from NBA teams, Tobias Harris was just a young lad who was drafted by the Bobcats and traded on draft night to the Bucks, where he spent the first 2 years of his career. Chris Middleton played his first season in Detroit with the Pistons before being traded for Brandon Jennings. That's a pretty good trade for Milwaukee in the long run, I'd say. In 2004, an 18-year-old J.R. Smith was actually drafted by the New Orleans Hornets. While doing this research, I actually found out that he was traded to Chicago for Tyson Chandler, and then just 6 days later, he was eventually traded to his first real home in Denver. Before being an important piece in the Spurs and Raptors finals runs, Danny Green was originally drafted by the Cleveland Cavaliers, even though he did end up joining the Cavs again in 2022, as well as playing just 3 games for the Memphis Grizzlies that same year. Does literally anybody remember the answer's 3 games on the Grizzlies? He signed with Memphis in September and had agreed to a contract buyout by November. Iverson also played a single season in Detroit, if anybody else remembers that. After spending 13 seasons with the Supersonics, the Glove decided to jump around to a few different teams. We talked about him trying to win a ring in LA, but he actually got one in his time in Miami. But probably most forgotten was his time in Milwaukee, where he only played in 28 games. He also spent a season in Boston, if anybody remembers that. Known for his time on the Suns and or the New York Knicks, Amar'e Stoudemire signed with the Dallas Mavericks after being waived by the Knicks during the season, meaning Stoudemire only played 23 games for Dallas in 2015. Weirdly enough, I don't even remember him playing for Miami the next season either. I swear, for some reason, it just felt like Andre Iguodala's lone season in Denver felt way longer than it actually was. Also, his time in Miami could probably be forgotten as well. It was just one of those seasons where it was in between his Golden State seasons and just felt like it never actually really happened. Everyone knows about Dwight Howard on the Magic, but he played for a variety of teams toward the end of his career. Side note, I didn't even realize his first stint in LA was only a season long. Anywho, does anybody remember Dwight Howard being on the Wizards? He only played 9 games for Washington. I'm sure these are more notable teams that people might remember him playing for, but he also played for Atlanta, Charlotte, and Philly. You probably remember Ben Wallace for his time in Detroit, but even before Wallace got to Detroit, he played for the Orlando Magic. You might have forgotten he also played for the Cavs, Bulls, and Wizards. Jerry Stackhouse played for many different teams during his career, but the weirdest of them all has to be his time in Miami in 2010. So what does that mean exactly? Well, that means Jerry Stackhouse actually played with the Miami Big Three. It was only for 7 games, but that was still something. Obviously, when you think of Rajon Rondo, you'd probably think of him in a Celtics uniform, but Rondo surprisingly played 1 season for 7 different teams. The ones you may have forgotten about were his 18 games on the Clippers, 21 games on the Cavs, or possibly the 27 games on the Atlanta Hawks. Speaking of Hawks, I remember Joe Johnson playing mostly for the Hawks and a little bit there for the Nets. But towards the end of his career, he played a few games for the Rockets and the Heat. It was also cool to see that he actually started his career in Boston. Towards the end of his career, he actually signed a 10-day contract with Boston and got to play a game for them. When I say the name Carmelo Anthony, you obviously think about his tenure in Denver and/or New York, but he played on 4 different teams after his time in New York. I personally think the most forgettable one was his 10 games in Houston. I could see how people thought his time in LA with Bron or his time in OKC with Westbrook and Paul George might have been more forgettable. It's very weird to say, but I think his time in Portland just seemed like it didn't happen. I mean, just from this image here, you know exactly where this is going. But if I had to guess, I would say Vince's most forgettable time was in Sacramento, mentoring a young De'Aaron Fox. But maybe another one of these teams he was on was more forgettable. Whenever I think of Zach Randolph, I just immediately think of him on the Grizzlies. Others might say the Trailblazers early on in his career. But even before his time in Memphis, he actually played for the Clippers and the Knicks. Alonzo Mourning spent 11 seasons in Miami, which is where I'd assume most people remember him from. Also, his time in Charlotte was pretty memorable as well. But did you know that Mourning played 30 games for the Nets before ultimately returning back to Miami? This is one of those players on forgotten teams that you just randomly bring up one day with your friends. Let them know about Rasheed Wallace's single game on the Atlanta Hawks. I'm not gonna get into it right now, but just know that it's a real thing. After 9 seasons on the Nets, Brook Lopez actually played a season for the Lakers. DeMarcus Cousins played his first 7 seasons with the Sacramento Kings, which is where I'd assume most people know him from. After that, he was on the Pelicans, in which he only played 65 games for them. After his tenure with the Pelicans, Cousins played for 5 different teams, and honestly, all of them could be the ones that were forgotten. So I'll just let you be the judge of which one it is. Personally, his time in LA just felt like it didn't happen. Whether you know him for his time on the Lakers, or his time on the Pacers, or even his time on the side of James Harden's cranium, you probably don't know or even remember that Metta World Peace, or Ron Artest, played for the Knicks for 29 games. 38-year-old Derek Fisher was on the Dallas Mavericks for 9 games. You might know Chauncey Billups from his time in Detroit, or even his time in Denver. But let the record show he was a Knick for 21 games and a Toronto Raptor for 29 games. However, I'm sure people might remember his tenure in Philadelphia, but what about his 28 games in Oklahoma City? Anyone forget that one? The league's youngest MVP, Derrick Rose, has bounced around between a few teams in his career after leaving Chicago. Probably the most forgotten was his time in Cleveland. Derrick Rose only spent 16 games there, where he was teammates with LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, Kevin Love, Isaiah Thomas. What a wild time. Now we're going to look at players on teams they ended their career with that you might have forgotten about. After playing 17, count 'em, 17 seasons in Houston, the Dream, Hakeem Olajuwon, was traded to the Toronto Raptors. He played a lone season with Vince Carter, and Hakeem retired as a Toronto Raptor. I totally did not realize how many teams Moses Malone actually played for. I've only seen videos and pictures of him in Houston and Philly, but he actually ended his career in San Antonio with the Spurs. The big fella played 15 seasons for the New York Knicks and achieved legend status there, but he left New York at 38 years old to play for the Seattle Supersonics. Yep, Patrick Ewing was a Supersonic, and that's not all. He actually had a final season after Seattle with the Orlando Magic. After 17 years in San Antonio, Tony Parker signed a deal to join the Charlotte Hornets. Tony spent 1 year there and only played 56 games. As you know, Penny Hardaway most notably played for the Magic and Suns, but he actually ended his career playing 16 games for the Miami Heat in 2007. This was a very weird team they had at one point. Penny, Alonzo Mourning, Shawn Marion, Jason Williams, Shaq, D. Wade, and they only won 15 games. Dominique Wilkins played 12 seasons for the Hawks. We all know that. But did you know that he played for the Celtics, Spurs, Clippers, and he would eventually end his career on the Orlando Magic? We all know Dennis Rodman for his time with the Bad Boy Pistons and his time in Chicago with Mike and crew. Yet after Chicago, he played 23 games for the Lakers and finished his career playing 12 games for the Dallas Mavericks. Yep, Dirk, Rodman, and Steve Nash were teammates. The Rain Man played 8 seasons in Seattle and even played for the Cavs and Trailblazers. But he finished his career in Orlando at the age of 33, where people were calling this version of him Fat Kemp. P-Mac played for a handful of teams in his career. Probably most forgotten was his time in Atlanta and New York. But did you know he was on the Spurs in 2012 and almost got himself a championship? Having a relatively short NBA career, Gilbert Arenas was really known for his time in Washington. But he also played for the Magic and would eventually end his career with the Grizzlies, playing 17 games for them. Pau Gasol played for 5 teams during his career, and all of them were relatively well remembered. Well, except for one. Let's see. You remember the Grizzlies, the Lakers, maybe the Spurs, Spurs and the Bulls? But what about his last season where he played 3 games for the Milwaukee Bucks? The man played 21 seasons in the NBA and 14 for the Boston Celtics. But many forget that Robert Parrish played his last season in Chicago with Michael Jordan at the age of 43. That's a W for him because he ended up picking up another ring as well. We all know Joakim Noah from his time on the Bulls, but he ended up playing for the Knicks and even the Grizzlies after his time in Chicago. Oh yeah, and he ended his career playing 5 games for the LA Clippers. Stephon Marbury was a really good point guard in the league before he left the NBA to go play in China. But before he left, he actually played 23 games for the Boston Celtics in 2008. Yes, this meant he played with Allen, Garnett, Pierce, and Rondo. Pistol Pete played for 3 teams during his short career. Most people remember Jazz or even the Hawks, where he started his career. But did you know that he ended his career playing 26 games for the Boston Celtics? Playing for 19 seasons, most of Jason Kidd's teams were pretty memorable. You probably remember him on the Nets, Mavs, even the Suns. But a 39-year-old Jason Kidd actually played his last season in New York with the Knicks. Rip Hamilton was a king of the mid-range, and to be honest, I really only remember his time in Detroit. But he actually started his career with the Wizards, and to my surprise, played his final 2 years in Chicago with D. Rose and the Bulls. Roy Hibbert was a presence for a minute there in Indiana, but I didn't know he played his final season in the league with the Hornets and the Nuggets. One of the league's best scorers in the 70s and 80s was George Gervin. He played 12 seasons for the Spurs, and I would assume most people remember him for that. Although, did you know that the Iceman played his final season with the Chicago Bulls? Yep, George Gervin and Michael Jordan were teammates at one point. I remember Tim Hardaway for being on the Warriors, but to my surprise, he spent the same amount of seasons in Miami as well. Surprisingly enough, he spent his final 2 NBA seasons in Denver and then Indiana. I think John Starks will always be remembered as a Knick, but he actually finished his career in Utah. But the most surprising thing here was Starks played 4 games for the Chicago Bulls. It definitely felt like Walt Frazier was a New York Knick for life, but he ended up playing his final 3 seasons in Cleveland, only playing 66 games for the Cavs. Brandon Roy had a super short career where he spent 5 seasons with the Trailblazers. Although he did try to come back and play again for the Timberwolves, but was only able to play 5 games for them. And there you have it, 50 NBA players on teams you might have forgotten about. Let me know in the comments if you remembered any of these. Also, let me know if I forgot any players so I can possibly do a part 2. Thank you so much for watching this video, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. I can't wait to talk to you all in the next video. See you there.